After 25 years of marriage, my husband waited until our anniversary dinner to tell me I was too old to love anymore. The strange thing about humiliation is that your body notices it before your heart does. My fingers went cold long before I understood the words coming out of my husband's mouth. Even now I still remember the sound of crystal glasses clinking softly around us while my entire life quietly cracked open in the middle of a crowded restaurant. The anniversary party had been Richard's idea. At least that was what he told everyone. 25 years deserves something special, he announced proudly for weeks while booking the private rooftop dining room at Bellamy House overlooking downtown Chicago. He invited friends, business partners, neighbors, even distant relatives I had not seen in years. At the time I thought he was being sentimental. Looking back now I realize he was preparing an audience. The city glowed beneath us that night through towering glass windows streaked with rain from an early spring storm. Candlelight flickered across white tablecloths while a jazz pianist played quietly near the champagne tower. I wore a dark emerald dress Richard once told me brought out my eyes. Emerald had always been his favorite color on me. Funny how men stop noticing the things they once claimed to adore. Or maybe they notice too much and begin resenting the proof of time attached to them. I remember standing near the balcony before dinner started watching younger women laugh near the bar in tight black dresses and expensive heels. For the first time in months I suddenly felt aware of every silver strand hidden beneath my salon color. Every fine line near my mouth. Every reminder that I was 58 years old and no longer the woman Richard married at 33. Marriage changes quietly before it changes all at once. People think betrayal begins with affairs or cruel words. It does not. It begins in silence. In delayed eye contact. In conversations that become shorter each month. In the way someone stops reaching for your hand without either of you mentioning it. Richard had been disappearing emotionally for years before he ever walked away physically. I just kept convincing myself stress was temporary. Menopause was making me emotional. His long work hours would settle down eventually. Women can survive almost anything except the moment. They finally stop lying to themselves. Dinner moved beautifully at first. Richard played the devoted husband perfectly. He kissed my cheek for photographs. Wrapped his arm around my waist. Told stories about our early years together that made everyone laugh warmly. Our friends toasted to one of the strongest marriages they knew. I smiled so much my cheeks actually hurt. Somewhere between the appetizers and dessert I caught Richard checking his phone repeatedly beneath the table. Each time his expression softened in a way I had not seen directed toward me in years. A softness meant for someone else. Then came the champagne toast. Richard stood slowly while guests applauded around him. Candlelight reflected against his silver cufflinks as he lifted his glass toward me with that polished corporate smile people trusted far too easily. 25 years is a long time, he began smoothly. A few guests laughed softly. I smiled politely even though something inside me tightened immediately. His voice sounded wrong. Too rehearsed. Too calm. And sometimes, he continued while staring directly at me, people stay in relationships longer than they should because they are afraid of change. The room grew quieter. I remember feeling suddenly warm beneath my dress despite the cold rain tapping against the windows outside. Richard loosened his tie slightly and gave a small shrug as though discussing the weather instead of our marriage. I think 25 years is enough, he said. I want someone younger. And honestly, Claire, I want you out of the apartment tomorrow. Silence spread across the rooftop dining room so completely that even the piano stopped. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My best friend Diane covered her mouth in shock across the table while Richard calmly took a sip of champagne like a man finishing a business presentation. I stared at him for several seconds waiting for some sign this was cruelty disguised as humor. But there was nothing in his face except relief. Cold, uncomplicated relief. Then something even stranger happened. Richard smiled. Actually smiled. I already signed the lease paperwork for the new place, he added casually. So it would just make things easier if you packed tonight. Around us, guests avoided eye contact with the desperate intensity of people witnessing something too intimate to interrupt. Humiliation is a lonely thing. Even in a crowded room, it isolates you completely. I looked down at the gold anniversary ring still resting beside my dinner plate and suddenly realized something almost absurd. Richard had spent 25 years believing he was the one carrying our marriage financially. The poor man truly had no idea whose name was actually printed on the deed to that apartment. For a moment I simply sat there staring at Richard across the candlelit table while rain slid slowly down the rooftop windows behind him. 25 years. Reduced to a speech between dessert and coffee. The strangest part was not the cruelty itself. It was how rehearsed he sounded. Like he had practiced every sentence carefully in front of a mirror before humiliating me in public. Richard always cared deeply about appearances. Even in college he ironed his shirts before class while living in a dorm room with broken heating and stained carpets. Presentation mattered to him more than comfort ever did. That obsession only grew stronger once his architecture firm became successful. By 59 he had mastered the art of looking like a devoted husband without actually behaving like one. The room remained painfully silent around us. Nobody knew where to look. Diane kept twisting her napkin nervously while her husband stared into his wine glass pretending not to hear. Across the table Richard's business partner Alan shifted uncomfortably in his chair and muttered something about getting more champagne. Cowards always find reasons to leave when honesty enters a room. Richard sighed dramatically as though my silence inconvenienced him. Claire, he said in that calm corporate voice he used during difficult negotiations, dragging this out emotionally is not going to help either of us. Emotionally. As though I were the irrational one sitting there stunned while he publicly dismantled our marriage between candlelight and jazz music. I looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him for perhaps the first time in years. His hair was thinner than he admitted. The expensive navy suit stretched slightly at his waist now despite the private trainer he bragged about constantly. Tiny lines framed his mouth from years of forced networking smiles. Aging terrified Richard and other people because it reminded him he could not outrun it himself. Suddenly memories began rearranging themselves quietly inside my mind. The late nights at the office that stopped including actual work calls. The sudden obsession with expensive skin treatments. The new cologne. The gym membership. The way he angled his phone screen away from me during dinner. Women always know long before they allow themselves to know. Is there someone else? I finally asked softly. Several guests visibly froze at the question. Richard did not even hesitate. Yes. Just that. One word. Clean and polished like a knife wrapped in velvet. Diane gasped quietly under her breath. I lowered my eyes toward the table for a moment because I suddenly understood something devastating. Richard was not nervous. He was relieved. Relieved to finally stop pretending. The affair had probably been happening for months. Maybe longer. And while I sat at home researching anniversary restaurants and choosing dresses that still made me feel beautiful at 58, my husband had already emotionally packed his bags. How old is she? I asked before I could stop myself. Richard leaned back casually in his chair. 32. Of course she was. Young enough to admire him. Young enough not to remember him struggling through his first failed business deal while eating frozen dinners in our tiny first apartment. Young enough to believe confidence and maturity were the same thing. Richard always loved women who reflected back the version of himself he wanted to see. He smiled faintly then and reached for his champagne again. Look, Claire, you are still attractive for your age. For your age. There it was. The sentence women learn to hate long before men realize how insulting it sounds. Attractive despite aging. Valuable despite existing naturally inside time. But I want a different life now, he continued. Something lighter. Less emotionally heavy. I almost laughed at that. Emotionally heavy. I had spent years carrying his anxieties, his stress, his endless ambition, his mother's illnesses, his career disappointments, his sleepless nights after failed contracts. Women become emotional storage units inside long marriages. We absorb everyone else's exhaustion until our own needs become invisible. Richard glanced around the silent room impatiently and loosened his tie another inch. "Can we please handle this like adults?" he asked. "Handle this like adults." Meaning quietly. Gracefully. Without embarrassing him. The irony nearly took my breath away. Because Richard still believed he controlled the ending of this story. He still believed the apartment waiting downtown belonged to the life he built. He had absolutely no idea that 23 years earlier my father placed that property entirely in my name before Richard. And I ever renovated a single wall. And sitting there beneath soft candlelight while my husband prepared to erase me publicly from his future, I realized something almost tragic. Richard never once bothered to ask whose foundation he had actually been standing on all these years. Rain continued sliding slowly down the rooftop windows while the city lights blurred beneath the storm outside. Nobody at the table touched their dessert. The slices of chocolate cake sat untouched beside melting vanilla ice cream while 20 years of friendships quietly dissolved under the weight of discomfort. Richard hated silence unless he controlled it. I watched irritation begin creeping across his face as nobody rushed to defend him the way he clearly expected. Men like Richard always imagine themselves as brave for telling the truth after months of deception. They mistake selfishness for honesty because admitting betrayal sounds noble inside their own heads. Diane finally cleared her throat softly beside me. "Richard," she said carefully, "maybe this conversation should happen privately." Richard gave a dismissive wave without even looking at her. "No. Dragging things out privately is exactly how people waste more years pretending." Pretending. I almost smiled at the word. Because Richard had spent the better part of a decade pretending to still love me while slowly emotionally withdrawing inch by inch until even our apartment began feeling like a hotel lobby shared by polite strangers. Looking back now, the signs seemed painfully obvious. Richard stopped asking how my day was. He stopped noticing when I changed my hair. Stopped reaching for me absent-mindedly while falling asleep. We still hosted dinner parties together. Still vacationed together. Still attended charity events smiling side by side in photographs. But emotionally we had already become co-workers managing a brand called marriage. Somewhere during the past few years Richard stopped seeing me as a woman and started seeing me as evidence of his age. "I did not want this to become ugly," he continued while adjusting his watch calmly. "But Claire refuses to acknowledge reality sometimes." Reality. Another favorite word of emotionally dishonest men. Reality usually means whatever protects them from guilt. I folded my hands quietly in my lap and studied the man sitting across from me. The strange thing was I no longer felt shocked. Hurt, yes. Humiliated, absolutely. But beneath the humiliation something colder was beginning to settle into place. Clarity. Richard had spent years slowly preparing me for abandonment without realizing it. Every lonely dinner. Every ignored conversation. Every distracted nod while I spoke. Emotional neglect does not arrive dramatically. It arrives through repetition. Tiny moments teaching you not to expect tenderness anymore. "Does she know you are still married?" I asked softly. Richard looked almost amused by the question. "She is not a child, Claire." There it was again. That subtle emphasis on youth. As though age itself had become my greatest offense. Around us several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances while pretending to focus on the skyline outside. Nobody wanted involvement. People love loyalty until loyalty becomes inconvenient socially. Richard leaned back in his chair with visible relief now that the truth was finally public. "Look," he said, lowering his voice slightly as though attempting kindness, "you will be fine. You are independent. Intelligent. You will land on your feet." The sentence landed strangely hard because it sounded almost rehearsed. Like something he told himself repeatedly to avoid confronting the damage he caused. I suddenly remembered a conversation from nearly 2 years earlier while renovating the apartment kitchen. The contractor asked Richard whether he wanted both names listed on the updated paperwork. Richard laughed and said casually, "Whatever Claire wants. Technically the place is hers anyway." At the time I barely noticed the comment. Now sitting beneath soft anniversary candles while my husband publicly attempted to remove me from property he did not legally own, the memory returned with almost cinematic clarity. Richard truly forgot. Somewhere over 25 years he convinced himself my inheritance became his achievement simply because he occupied the same rooms. That happens often in long marriages. Women quietly build foundations while men slowly begin believing they poured the concrete themselves. Alan returned awkwardly carrying another bottle of champagne nobody wanted anymore. Richard accepted a refill immediately while Diane stared at me with watery eyes full of pity. I hated pity more than humiliation. Humiliation passes eventually. Pity lingers in people's memories forever. Richard loosened his collar slightly and checked his phone again beneath the table. This time I caught the small smile before he hit it. Someone younger was waiting for him tonight. Probably texting impatiently while he finalized the ending of his old life over anniversary cake and expensive champagne. Suddenly the entire evening felt deeply pathetic. Not heartbreaking. Pathetic. Because Richard believed he was beginning a glamorous new chapter while publicly discarding the very woman who quietly financed the stability he built his identity upon. And for the first time all night I realized something almost comforting. The man humiliating me across this table had absolutely no idea how badly he was about to humiliate himself. I reached for my champagne glass slowly even though my hands no longer felt steady. Around me the rooftop dining room remained suspended in that strange social paralysis that happens when wealthy polite people witness cruelty but cannot decide whether acknowledging it would ruin the evening further. Outside the window Chicago glowed silver beneath the rain while thunder rolled softly in the distance. Somewhere near the bar a waiter quietly stopped refilling glasses because even the staff understood something ugly had entered the room. Richard checked his watch again. That small movement irritated me more than his affair somehow. The impatience. As though humiliating his wife publicly had become another unpleasant obligation delaying him from somewhere more exciting. "Claire," he said with visible frustration now, "I did not want this turning into a dramatic scene." Dramatic. Women become dramatic the moment they react to disrespect instead of absorbing it silently. I set my champagne glass down carefully beside my untouched dessert plate and finally spoke the thought sitting quietly inside my chest all evening. "How long have you been unhappy?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. Richard blinked once before looking away toward the skyline. "That is not really the point." "No," I said softly. "I think it is exactly the point." For a moment the room became so quiet I could hear rain tapping gently against the rooftop glass. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose the way he always did whenever emotions complicated a conversation he preferred controlling logically. "Things changed years ago," he admitted finally. "You stopped caring about yourself the same way." There it was. Not grief. Not loneliness. Not emotional distance. Appearance. Richard measured love visually now. I looked down at my hands resting calmly in my lap. The hands that packed his lunches for years while working full-time managing my father's real estate investments after his death. The hands that sat beside hospital beds when Richard's mother developed dementia. The hands that signed renovation checks for the apartment he now planned to throw me out of tomorrow. What exactly changed? I asked quietly. Richard loosened his tie further and leaned back in his chair. "You became comfortable." Comfortable. Another cruel word disguised as criticism. Women spend decades creating comfort for everyone else only to discover men eventually resent the softness they once begged for. Diane stared openly at Richard now with visible disgust while several guests shifted awkwardly in their seats pretending not to listen despite hanging on to every sentence. "You used to care more," Richard continued carefully. "About your appearance. About excitement. About keeping things," he paused searching for the right word. Alive. Alive. I almost smiled sadly at that. Because Richard stopped noticing me long before I stopped trying. 3 years earlier I surprised him with a weekend trip to Napa Valley for his birthday. He spent most of it answering work emails from the hotel balcony. The year before that I booked tickets to Italy after he once mentioned wanting to revisit Florence someday. He canceled 2 weeks before departure because a younger associate at his firm needed supervision on a new project. Her name was Madison. 32 years old apparently. Funny how memory sharpens once truth finally arrives. You mean younger, I said calmly. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. I mean different. Different. Another cowardly word. People use different when they want to avoid admitting shallow. I studied my husband carefully beneath the soft candlelight and suddenly realized something deeply sad. Richard did not actually look happy. Relieved, yes. Excited, maybe. But not peaceful. Men chasing youth rarely chase love. They chase reflection. Proof that time has not won yet. Alan quietly excused himself again while Diane reached beneath the table and squeezed my hand gently. Across from me Richard seemed increasingly uncomfortable now that I was not crying. I think he expected tears. Begging perhaps. Anger at minimum. Anything proving he still held emotional power over me. But humiliation changes shape after a while. Eventually it becomes observation. And the more I observed Richard that night the smaller he appeared somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. I never wanted to hurt you, he said finally with rehearsed sincerity. That sentence almost made me laugh out loud. Because people who truly fear hurting someone do not schedule public abandonment beside anniversary cake and champagne towers. They do not invite witnesses. They do not humiliate a woman in front of everyone she knows simply to avoid difficult private conversations. No. Richard wanted freedom without guilt. He wanted applause for honesty after months of betrayal. And worst of all, he genuinely believed he was walking away from this marriage with a better future. Slowly I glanced toward the microphone stand near the small jazz stage where anniversary speeches had been given earlier in the evening. Then I looked back at my husband sitting comfortably inside confidence built partly upon property he did not legally own. And for the first time all night I felt something stronger than humiliation beginning to rise quietly beneath my ribs. Not revenge. Clarity. The jazz pianist quietly began playing again somewhere near the bar, although the music sounded hesitant now, as if even he sensed the mood inside the rooftop dining room had changed permanently. Rain pressed harder against the windows while lightning flickered faintly across the Chicago skyline beyond the glass. Richard reached for his phone again beneath the table, and for the first time in 25 years of marriage I did not wonder who he was texting. I already knew. There is something strangely peaceful about finally seeing reality clearly after years of emotional fog. Painful, yes. But peaceful too. Claire, Richard said with forced patience, I think we should leave before this becomes even more uncomfortable. Even more uncomfortable. As though public humiliation had levels. Diane let out a short bitter laugh under her breath while several guests pretended not to hear. I looked around the room slowly then. At the people who watched us celebrate anniversaries for decades. The couples who vacationed with us. The neighbors who brought wine to our holiday parties every December. They all looked deeply uncomfortable now because long marriages create illusions people become emotionally invested in. When a marriage collapses publicly, it forces everyone nearby to question their own stability too. Richard stood slowly and buttoned his suit jacket with visible impatience. I booked a hotel for tonight, he announced quietly. You can gather your things tomorrow afternoon. Gather your things. The words echoed strangely in my mind. My father bought that apartment in 2001 after selling part of his commercial property holdings downtown. I still remember the afternoon he handed me the folder containing the deed across his office desk. Never put all your security into another person's hands, he told me gently. At the time I thought he sounded cynical. My parents adored each other for 40 years. But my father grew up watching women trapped financially inside unhappy marriages because love convinced them ownership was unnecessary. So when Richard and I renovated the apartment together after our 10th anniversary, my father insisted the property remain entirely under my name. Richard signed every document without reading carefully because he trusted appearances more than paperwork. That was always his weakness. He noticed polished surfaces and ignored foundations. I looked up at him standing beside the table now with the confidence of a man believing he controlled every outcome in the room. The affair. The narrative. The apartment. My humiliation. It suddenly struck me how little Richard truly understood the woman he married. For 25 years I managed our investments quietly while he chased promotions and architecture awards. I handled taxes, property maintenance, insurance, renovation contracts. Richard liked telling people he built our life from nothing but ambition and hard work. I let him believe that because marriage often requires allowing men small illusions to protect their pride. But there is a dangerous side effect to protecting someone's ego for too long. Eventually they begin mistaking your silence for dependence. Richard glanced toward the elevator impatiently. Somewhere else in the city a 32-year-old woman was likely waiting for him, believing she had won something glamorous. Youth often mistakes attention for love. Claire, he said more firmly now, do not make this harder than it needs to be. Harder for who? Him. Always him. Richard spent years quietly withdrawing affection while expecting emotional comfort from me uninterrupted. Men like him do not actually want independence. They want freedom from accountability. Suddenly I felt exhaustion settle heavily through my body. Not dramatic heartbreak. Just deep tiredness. 25 years of anticipating moods. Managing tension. Excusing emotional neglect. Protecting a man determined to prioritize himself eventually drains something essential from a woman. Diane squeezed my arm gently. You do not have to leave tonight, she whispered. Richard immediately frowned. Diane, this really is between me and Claire. Funny how men invoke privacy only after humiliating women publicly. I looked toward the small stage near the champagne tower where the microphone still rested untouched beneath soft golden lighting. Earlier that evening guests used it for anniversary toasts and embarrassing marriage stories. Richard's speech remained hanging invisibly in the air above the room like smoke nobody could clear away. Slowly I stood from my chair. Several people instinctively looked up at me at once. Richard's expression tightened immediately. Claire, he warned quietly. Warned. As though I were a child preparing to misbehave instead of a woman publicly discarded after 25 years. I smoothed the front of my emerald dress calmly and reached for my champagne glass one final time before setting it back down untouched. Then without another word I began walking toward the microphone while the entire rooftop dining room watched in complete silence. And behind me for the first time all night I heard uncertainty enter Richard's voice. Claire, he called again, softer now. What are you doing? Every pair of eyes in the rooftop dining room followed me as I walked toward the small stage beside the champagne tower. I could feel the tension pressing through the room like humidity before a storm. Crystal glasses rested untouched on white linen tables while candlelight flickered softly against the rain streaking the windows behind me. Somewhere near the bar the pianist stopped playing again entirely. Even the staff had frozen. Richard hated unpredictability more than failure. And for the first time that evening he no longer looked calm. He looked uncertain. Claire, he said again behind me, sharper this time. Please do not turn this into something embarrassing. Embarrassing. The word almost made me smile. Publicly discarding your wife of 25 years during an anniversary dinner apparently was not embarrassing. But allowing her to respond might be. I reached the microphone stand slowly and adjusted it slightly higher. The sound echoed softly through the silent rooftop room. My reflection stared back at me faintly in the dark glass windows behind the stage. 58 years old. Tired eyes. Emerald dress. A woman who suddenly realized she had spent years shrinking herself emotionally to protect a man terrified of feeling ordinary. I wrapped both hands lightly around the microphone and looked out at the guests sitting frozen beneath golden candlelight. Friends. Neighbors. Business associates. People who watched Richard and me build an entire life together, one dinner party at a time. First, I said calmly, my voice carrying clearly across the room, I would like to thank everyone for coming tonight. Richard exhaled sharply behind me. I did not look at him. 25 years is a long time to share a life with someone, I continued softly. Long enough to memorize the sound of their footsteps in the hallway. Long enough to know exactly how they take their coffee every morning. Long enough to stop noticing the small loneliness growing quietly between you because routine can disguise almost anything. The room remained completely silent. Diane watched me with tears in her eyes now while several guests lowered their gazes uncomfortably toward the tablecloths. Richard is right about one thing, I said. People do stay in relationships longer than they should sometimes. I heard Richard shift behind me immediately. Nervous now. Good. Sometimes women convince themselves emotional neglect is temporary because they remember who someone used to be. Sometimes we keep protecting marriages long after we are the only ones still protecting them. Rain rolled harder against the windows outside while distant thunder softened beneath the skyline. I glanced briefly toward Richard then. He looked pale beneath the warm candlelight. But what surprises me most tonight is not that my husband wants someone younger, I said carefully. What surprises me is how completely he forgot who actually owns the apartment he is trying to throw me out of tomorrow. Silence. True silence this time. The kind that empties oxygen from a room. Richard's face changed instantly. Not anger at first. Confusion. Then disbelief. Alan slowly lowered his champagne glass halfway to the table while several guests turned sharply toward Richard all at once. Claire, Richard said quietly, warning entering his voice again. I continued anyway. The apartment downtown was purchased through my family trust 23 years ago after my father sold part of his commercial properties. The deed has remained entirely in my name ever since. Someone near the back of the room actually gasped softly. Richard stared at me now with an expression I had not seen on his face in years. Fear. Real fear. Richard signed every renovation contract without reading carefully because he always trusted appearances more than details, I continued calmly. Which is ironic considering appearances seem to matter so much to him now. A nervous, uncomfortable laugh escaped from one of the business associates before dying quickly in the silence. Richard stepped toward the stage finally. Claire, this is not the time, no, I interrupted softly. Actually, I think this is exactly the time. My voice remained calm but something inside me had shifted permanently now. Not rage. Not revenge. Freedom. 25 years of emotional restraint suddenly dissolving beneath candlelight and rain. You wanted honesty tonight, I said while looking directly at my husband. So let us be honest. You spent years treating me like background furniture in my own life while standing comfortably inside security my family built long before you arrived. Richard's jaw tightened visibly. Several guests avoided looking at him altogether now. You told me to pack tomorrow, I said quietly. But Richard, you are the one who needs a new address. The rooftop room erupted instantly into whispers sharp enough to cut glass. Richard stood completely speechless near the stage while rain hammered against the windows behind us, and for the first time all evening the man who spent years controlling every room he entered looked utterly unprepared for the truth. The whispers spread across the rooftop dining room almost instantly after my words landed. Not loud chaotic whispers. Quiet wealthy whispers. The kind spoken behind manicured hands and expensive champagne glasses when people realize a polished social performance has suddenly collapsed in public. Richard remained frozen near the stage staring at me as though I had begun speaking another language entirely. I watched confusion struggle against humiliation behind his eyes while rain thundered softly against the windows framing the Chicago skyline. That is not funny, Claire, he said finally, although his voice no longer sounded confident. It sounded thin. Smaller somehow. I stepped away from the microphone slowly. I am not trying to be funny. Diane covered her mouth to hide what looked dangerously close to a smile while Alan stared openly at Richard now with the uncomfortable expression of a man suddenly recalculating years of assumptions. Richard glanced around the room quickly searching for control again. But control had already left him. Once truth enters a room publicly, it becomes impossible to gather neatly back into silence. There must be some misunderstanding, he said sharply. We renovated that apartment together. Together. Funny how quickly people claim partnership after assuming ownership. I folded my hands calmly in front of me and looked at the man I once believed would grow old beside me. Yes, I said softly. We renovated it together. But legally the property belongs to me through my family trust. It always has. Richard laughed then, but the sound carried panic beneath it now. Claire, stop this. Stop this. As though I had created the humiliation tonight instead of merely surviving it. You signed the documents yourself, I continued calmly. Although to be fair, you rarely read paperwork carefully unless it involved your own contracts. Several guests exchanged looks immediately. Richard's face lost more color beneath the golden candlelight. Deep down he knew I was telling the truth. That was the problem. There are moments when people realize arrogance blinded them completely and the recognition arrives all at once like cold water. Richard suddenly looked older to me standing there beside the stage. Not physically. Spiritually. The confidence that once filled every room around him had begun cracking visibly beneath embarrassment. Claire, maybe we should discuss this privately, he said more quietly now. There it was. Privacy. Men always rediscover the value of privacy once public humiliation belongs to them instead of the woman they wounded. I looked around the room slowly before answering. You invited everyone here tonight, I reminded him gently. You made our marriage a public conversation first. Silence settled heavily over the guests again. Outside the windows lightning flashed faintly above the skyline while servers stood motionless near the kitchen entrance pretending not to listen despite hearing every word. Diane finally stood from her chair and crossed toward me slowly in her black satin dress. She wrapped one arm gently around my shoulders and for the first time all evening I nearly cried. Not because of Richard. Because kindness after humiliation feels almost unbearable sometimes. Richard noticed the gesture immediately and his jaw tightened. He hated appearing isolated socially. Reputation mattered to him almost as much as youth. You are overreacting, he muttered toward me although his voice lacked conviction now. Diane looked at him with open disgust. No, Richard, she said quietly. You publicly discarded your wife at your own anniversary dinner. Richard immediately looked away from her. Cowardice rarely survives direct eye contact. I suddenly remembered another evening nearly 7 years earlier after Richard received an architecture award downtown. During his acceptance speech he thanked business mentors, colleagues, investors, everyone except me. Later when I mentioned it privately he laughed and said I was being sensitive. You know, I appreciate you, he told me casually while checking emails. That was Richard's specialty. Making emotional neglect sound rational. Over time women begin questioning their own loneliness because emotionally unavailable men frame disappointment as overreaction. Who is she? Diane asked quietly before I could stop her. Richard exhaled heavily through his nose. That is nobody's business. Nobody's business. Interesting considering he announced his desire for younger women into a microphone 40 minutes earlier. Alan rubbed his forehead awkwardly and muttered something about needing air before slipping toward the balcony. Other guests began quietly gathering purses and coats, realizing the celebration had transformed permanently into something else entirely. But nobody actually left yet. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable around humiliation and deeply fascinated by it at the same time. Richard looked at me again then with something new in his expression. Not remorse. Calculation. He was trying to determine whether the apartment situation could still somehow be managed quietly before word spread further through our social circle. I recognized that look immediately. The same expression he wore during difficult business negotiations. And suddenly after 25 years together I understood something devastatingly simple. Richard never truly viewed marriage as emotional partnership. To him everything eventually became leverage. Status. Optics. Advantage. Even love. Especially love. I picked up my coat slowly from the back of my chair while the rooftop dining room remained suspended inside uncomfortable silence. Richard watched every movement carefully now, like a man realizing too late that the woman he underestimated had stopped protecting him. People began leaving slowly after that. Not dramatically. Quietly. Wealthy people rarely flee uncomfortable situations openly. They retreat with careful politeness while pretending the evening simply ended earlier than expected. Coats disappeared from chair backs. Champagne glasses remained half full on linen tables. Soft murmurs floated through the rooftop dining room beneath the storm outside while guests avoided looking directly at Richard as they passed him near the stage. That seemed to affect him more than anything else. Public admiration had always fed something inside him. And now for the first time in years he stood alone without control of the narrative surrounding him. Diane stayed beside me while I slipped my coat carefully over my shoulders. "Do you want me to come home with you tonight?" she asked quietly. Home. The word landed differently now. Strange how quickly emotional territory shifts once illusion disappears. I glanced toward Richard standing several feet away staring out at the rain-soaked skyline with his jaw tight and his phone clenched in one hand. "No," I said softly. "I think I need to see my life clearly for the first time in a long while." Diane squeezed my hand gently before gathering her purse. "Call me if you need anything." I nodded and watched her disappear toward the elevator with the last remaining guests. Within minutes the rooftop dining room emptied almost completely except for staff quietly clearing untouched desserts and folding abandoned napkins. The jazz pianist packed his sheet music silently near the corner stage while thunder rolled faintly across the city beyond the glass. Richard still had not looked directly at me again. That surprised me somehow. After all his confidence earlier in the evening I expected anger by now. Defensiveness perhaps. But instead he looked deeply unsettled. Because humiliation feels very different once you become the one standing inside it. "Claire," he said finally without turning around, "you embarrassed me tonight." I almost laughed at the absurdity of the sentence. "Did I?" I asked quietly. Richard faced me then, and for the first time all evening I saw genuine emotion breaking through his polished composure. Not sadness. Resentment. There was no reason to make things public like that. Public. Again that word. Men who weaponize public humiliation against women often become deeply offended when consequences arrive publicly in return. I walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city. Raindrops distorted the lights below into blurred streaks of gold and silver across the dark glass. "You announced the end of our marriage into a microphone during our anniversary dinner," I reminded him softly. "What exactly did you think would happen afterward?" Richard exhaled heavily and rubbed one hand across his forehead. Suddenly he looked exhausted. Older. Human in a way he rarely allowed himself to appear. "I just wanted honesty," he muttered. No. Richard wanted freedom without discomfort. "There is a difference." "When did you stop loving me?" I asked quietly before I could stop myself. The question settled between us heavily while staff cleared dishes in the distance pretending not to hear. Richard looked away toward the skyline again. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "Maybe years ago." Years ago. The honesty hurt more than the affair somehow. Because it confirmed what my body already knew long before my mind accepted it. I had been grieving this marriage alone for years without realizing I was mourning something already dead. Richard loosened his tie completely now and sank into one of the empty velvet dining chairs beside the windows. "I did care about you once," he said softly. Once. I stared at the man sitting there beneath dim chandelier light and suddenly memories flooded through me unexpectedly. Richard carrying moving boxes into our first apartment at 34. Richard crying quietly after his father's funeral while I held him through the night. Richard dancing with me barefoot in our unfinished kitchen after the renovation workers finally left. Love had existed once. Real love. That was the tragedy. Long marriages rarely collapse because people were always monsters. They collapse because people slowly stop protecting tenderness once familiarity convinces them effort is optional. Madison makes you feel younger, I said quietly. Richard gave a tired, humorless smile. She makes me feel noticed. The sentence hit me strangely hard because beneath all his cruelty sat something painfully ordinary. Fear. Aging. Irrelevance. Men often chase younger women not because youth is better but because youth reflects back a version of themselves untouched by time. I looked at him sitting there in expensive shoes and wrinkled arrogance suddenly reduced into tired middle-aged loneliness. And for the first time all evening I no longer felt humiliated. I felt free. Deeply unexpectedly free. Because once someone finally shows you exactly how little they are willing to value your heart, staying loyal to your own suffering stops feeling noble. It starts feeling unnecessary. I picked up my purse carefully from the table and headed toward the elevator while Richard remained seated beside the rain-streaked windows. Just before the doors closed he finally looked up at me with quiet uncertainty. "Where are you going?" he asked softly. I met his eyes one last time across the nearly empty rooftop room. "Home," I answered. "You will need to find somewhere else tonight." 3 months later the apartment felt quieter than it had in years. Not lonely. Quiet. There is a difference between silence and peace, although many women confuse the two after long marriages. Early autumn sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors each morning while the city moved below my windows in soft distant rhythms untouched by my private grief. For the first few weeks after the anniversary dinner I kept expecting Richard's key in the front door out of habit. 25 years trains your body to anticipate another person's presence even after they leave. But eventually, the waiting disappears. Human beings adjust to absence faster than they admit. Richard moved into a luxury high-rise downtown with Madison almost immediately. I only know because mutual friends talked carefully around me the way people discuss illnesses they hope are temporary. Apparently the relationship looked glamorous from the outside. Rooftop bars. Weekend trips. Expensive restaurants. The sort of romance middle-aged men create when they are trying to convince themselves they still belong inside youth. But cracks appeared quickly. Madison disliked how often Richard checked his hairline in mirrors. Richard disliked how frequently Madison photographed everything for social media. Eventually even their arguments sounded exhausting secondhand. Funny how fantasy becomes ordinary once daily life arrives. Diane visited often during those first months. We drank wine in the kitchen while watching storms move across the skyline exactly the way Richard and I used to years earlier before silence settled permanently between us. One night she asked me something nobody else had dared say aloud. "Do you miss him?" I thought carefully before answering. "I miss who I believed he was." That was the honest truth. The man I mourned no longer existed by the end of our marriage. Maybe he disappeared gradually over time. Maybe I simply stopped ignoring who he had always been underneath ambition and charm. Either way, grief becomes lighter once illusion finally dies. Richard called several times during the first month pretending practical matters required discussion. Tax paperwork. Storage boxes. Insurance transfers. But beneath every conversation sat something heavier neither of us acknowledged directly. Regret. Not necessarily regret for leaving. Regret for misjudging me so completely. The apartment changed everything psychologically for him. Richard built his identity around being the provider, the successful husband, the architect of our life together. Discovering he had publicly attempted to remove me from property that legally belonged entirely to me shattered something fundamental inside his pride. Men survive heartbreak more easily than humiliation. Especially public humiliation. One afternoon he came by while I was reorganizing the bookshelves in the study. He looked tired standing in the doorway holding a cardboard box of old photographs and winter coats. Older too. Not because of age. Because certainty had left him. Madison was waiting downstairs in the car, and somehow that detail saddened me more than anger ever could. "You changed the locks," he observed quietly. "Yes," I answered. Richard nodded slowly, as though the reality of it finally settled fully into his chest at that moment. Home no longer meant him. We stood awkwardly inside the apartment we once renovated together while afternoon sunlight touched the walls we painted side by side nearly 15 years earlier. "I never thought things would end like this," he admitted softly. "Neither did I. But marriages rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. They erode slowly through unattended loneliness until eventually one person decides emotional distance feels easier than repair." Richard looked around the living room carefully then. "You redecorated?" "A little. I removed several heavy dark furniture pieces after he left. The apartment felt brighter now somehow. Lighter. Like opening windows in a room closed too long." Richard gave a faint, almost sad smile. "It suits you." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then quietly he said the thing I think he should have admitted years earlier. "I stopped seeing you clearly." The sentence hung between us softly. Honest at last. Not because he suddenly became noble, but because losing comfort often forces truth out of people eventually. I looked at the man I once planned to grow old beside and realized something unexpected. I was no longer angry. Exhausted, yes. Changed, absolutely. But not angry. Because once someone reveals how small they are willing to make your heart feel, loving yourself enough to walk away stops feeling tragic. It starts feeling necessary. Richard left a few minutes later carrying the empty box back toward the elevator alone. Just before the doors closed he looked at me one final time with quiet uncertainty. Almost like he expected me to stop him. 25 years ago I probably would have. But standing inside the apartment my father protected for me long before I understood why women needed protecting sometimes, I simply smiled gently and let the elevator doors close. Then I walked back inside my peaceful home and locked the door behind me.